Well, welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast about liberal arts and classical education. I'm your host, Clay Green, a postdoctoral fellow here at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. Today, I'm going to be talking to Alastair Roberts. Alastair holds a PhD from Durham University. He works for both the Theopolis and Davenant Institutes. He is the co-author of Echoes of Exodus, Tracing Themes of Redemption Through Scripture, and is working on Heirs Together, a Theology of the Sexes. Beyond his written work, Alastair's influence also spans various media platforms. He co-hosts the theology podcasts Mere Fidelity and Theopolis. He maintains an insightful blog known as Alastair's Adversaria and shares his theological perspectives through regular video content on his YouTube channel. His YouTube channel also contains a chapter-by-chapter commentary on the entire Bible. Isn't that right, that you've covered the entire Bible at this point?
Pretty much. There are 10 chapters of Joshua, some chapters of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, of Ezekiel, and some of the Psalms. But apart from that, everything's done, including the whole New Testament. That's
absolutely amazing. I think it's the cliche to ask this, but when do you sleep, Alastair?
Well, not that much, but yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I'm excited to have you.
It's great to be on. Thank you for inviting me.
So maybe I thought you could start out by describing these two institutes that you work for and what sort of purpose they serve. Maybe first, what is the Theopolis Institute? I was very curious about that when I began reading about it. So maybe you could say a little bit about what it is.
Certainly. The Theopolis Institute is based in Birmingham. It has its origins about 10 years ago. It was founded in part out of the work of a group called Biblical Horizons, which was based around James Jordan's work. James Jordan is famous for the book Through New Eyes, which is about how we read the scripture and how scripture gets worked out in liturgy and symbolism and typology. And so that was really at the genesis of the movement. Theopolis offers as its flagship program a fellows program, and there are usually about 10 to 15 fellows who are trained in how to read the Bible in its totality, with theology, with the sort of literary aspects of it, thinking about it typologically, symbolically, and then thinking about how we do liturgy. So thinking about liturgy in a more theoretical, theological way, but also thinking about it practically, training in leading churches in song, reading the Bible publicly, training in the recovery of the Psalter and things like that. So the work of Theopolis is carried out in its actual programs, some of those residential and some of those just online courses, and then also through teaching in various other fora, through production of material. Recently have books coming out on a number of subjects. One that has just come out on the subject of Sunday by my friend Jack Vanisevich. And then there will be articles, lots of audio. There's a Theopolis app as well, if people would like to look into it. But I've been working for them for several years now, and my work has been fairly varied, from writing books to being on podcasts. I'm a regular on the Theopolis podcast, and then various forms of teaching.
And how many students has the Theopolis Institute taught? Is it hundreds?
Yeah, it will be hundreds. But it really, there are a variety of different students. So there would be the actual students for the fellows program, where we have very intense interaction with them and keep contact with them long after the fellows program that they've been part of, the they've been members of, has passed on. We always have that sort of connection with those groups because they've had such intense time with the fellows. Beyond that, though, we have lots of online courses. We have regional courses, special events. I've just finished teaching an intensive course in Birmingham on the subject of the Exodus. So all of these are aspects of our teaching, and there will be students who've been informed in various forms of those courses.
Great, thank you. So I first encountered you through the Davenant Institute, taking your Exodus class. I imagine it's similar to the one you offered at Theopolis recently.
Not
Yeah,
dissimilar. The one
not
I offered
dissimilar.
for
Okay.
Theopolis was a lot more intense and in
Okay.
depth.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that one was leisurely enough that I could get through it on a full-time job. Uh, so what is Davenant? What purpose does it serve, and how does it compare to Theopolis?
Davenant began again about 10 years ago,
Mm.
and its origins were in many ways in an email discussion list, a group of theologians and scholars, pastors who were thinking through various issues together in this email discussion list that then gradually we all wanted to actually meet up in person to collaborate on various projects. And so it was about 10 years ago that we had the first what's called convivium. And the convivium is a time where there were about 30 of us got together, spent time eating together, talking together, and it was based around a conference. So there were a number of talks each day, and then time for conversation afterwards in a property that's just conducive for that sort of interaction. Lots of different nooks and crannies that you can get into one-to-one conversations with, but also these wider open areas for broader conversations with a larger group. That, in turn, became a number of other things. There was retrieval of old material, Protestant writings, and then gradually moving into translation work as well. There were summer programs. I taught a few of those, teaching younger students, generally about 18 to 30 range, teaching them the basics of Protestant wisdom. So it was a grounding within a range of different areas of thought and how Christian thought can come to bear upon those. So everything from how we view the world, how we understand society and politics. And so it was dealing with those sorts of things. In time, we developed the Davenant Hall, which is an online teaching program. And there are various ways that people can use that. Some people are just auditing courses. The courses are very affordable. It's accessible for students who don't have necessarily an extensive academic background. It's also something that provides more intense training for people who want to get into a fuller course of theology. And so we offer those sorts of courses. We do events, conferences, we have regional convivia, and we've got at this point, quite a large number of books that we have produced. Some of them that are reprinted, some that are modernized. So one of my favorites is Richard Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity that have been modernized in the first few volumes at least, and that's an ongoing project. So that's a flavor of some of the things that we do as Davenant. It's different from Theopolis in that its emphasis is far more upon it's retrieving theology from the early Protestants, Protestant scholastics and others. It's teaching people how to read Aquinas, things like that. My friend Ryan Hurd is doing absolutely incredible work in that area. I'd highly recommend that people take some of his classes. And we're more generally getting involved in a range of conversations that are more theological and social in character, in a way that Theopolis has more of a biblical emphasis and accent, and an emphasis moving towards liturgy. And so those things can work together very well. And so I'd be a sort of intersection between the two projects, which are distinct, but there is some overlap. And I'm probably the place where the overlap is.
Okay, great. Well, this reminds me that I would love at some point to put you in contact with a good friend of mine who was a PhD student at Yale named Jamie Dunn, who happens to be English as well. But the reason why I mention this is because he wrote his dissertation on Protestant scholasticism, especially Protestant Aristotelianism, which is something that until I talked to him, I confess I didn't know existed. And I think maybe a lot of people are that way.
Well, there are certainly people within Davenant who'd be very interested to interact with someone working in that area.
Yes, great, great. Why do you think we need things like the Theopolis Institute and Davenant? What role do you see them serving alongside the traditional academy as it exists today?
I think they serve a number of purposes. One is a sort of bridge between the academy and the church, a place where people who have thought rigorously about issues within the context of the academy can share their findings and bring others into their area of study who would not necessarily have access to the academy. Sometimes that's for the sake of their other vocational commitments. Many of the people who take our courses are full-time pastors, or there are people who are working in all sorts of areas of society. There are stay-at-home mothers, there are people who are in some area of political work, whatever it is. For many people, that it would rule out the possibility of them doing theological study, were it not for institutions that offer the sorts of things that Theopolis and Davenant do. And so that's part of the hope, to encourage a greater resourcing of the laity. So within their greater realms of expertise and vocation, to be able to draw upon the legacy of Christian reflection. So that's part of it. I think also to encourage a network of scholars and pastors, people whose vocation is the study of scripture and theology, to encourage a network where they can be mutually supporting, encouraging, and stimulating. That's one of the things that I think many of us have experienced, the loneliness of looking into these sorts of areas and not having companions along the way. And so Davenant and Theopolis are part of what they're doing, is creating a network of companions along the way. If you're a pastor, if you're someone who's interested in theology, if you are a theologian, you'll often find that you're in hostile contexts, or you're in contexts where you just don't have companions to talk to who are at the same level or depth of reflection. And so that's one of the things that's offered. Another thing I think that's offered is the rigor that you have within the academy. There's often not something that people have within lay studies of scripture and theology. They don't necessarily have that rigor and that testing. They're thinking through these issues and wanting to go deeper. But some of the disciplines and other things that you learn within the context of the academy haven't been brought to bear upon their studies. And so when they receive that sort of background, it really helps them in their areas of study. I think the other thing is trying to break Christians out of the siloed character of many institutions. So Christian institutions can often create small ponds within which you have big fish, but outside of those small ponds, no one really knows who those people are. We're trying, I think, among other things, to bring Christian faith into a broader public conversation. And part of what that requires is networks that span Christian institutions, but also secular universities and institutions that get involved in wider public conversations and issues of society and politics, economics, etc. The other thing I've really found, and it's been a burden for me in the context of the UK, is the big gulf between the sort of level of education that you have within the typical church and the level of education that you get within the academy. So on the one hand, in the academy, you have not very committed Christian faith, but really deep and rigorous theology being done in some circles. A number of places in the UK where you can see really good theology being done, but at least academically rigorous. But there's a detachment from the life of the church, where within the life of the church, certainly in the UK, there's very little Christian education taking place. And as a result, you have lay people who really do not have the foundation to go further. They've not been trained as children. There's not much of an expectation that the church should be forming a more rigorous thinking set of people in the pews who are thinking rigorously about theology and society in the light of Christian faith. Christian faith then becomes a more privatized, individual, sort of sentimentalized perspective on the world that's very much focused upon conversion, a shallow activism, and there's little of a sense of the depth of Christian reflection that is possible about society and other issues. Now, that's something that is a tragedy because we have a long history of thinking rigorously about society, about the way that the faith comes to bear upon various areas of life, about the depths of the Christian faith itself and the depths of the biblical literature. And people are just closed out from those areas of reflection because they don't have teachers. And so part of the concern of Theopolis and Avenant is to provide this broader body of material and these teachers, these pastors, to train people to be able to build up others and to create a broader and a deeper base for Christian education within the church at large. So once you've got that broader and that deeper base, there's a lot more that you can build upon it. And once you've built upon it, you can actually start to get positively invested in all sorts of areas of life that are currently closed to us because we're just not mature enough to be able to speak into them with a thoughtful Christian voice.
Great. Well, I think y'all are certainly doing great work. And while we're on the subject of education, maybe you could say a little bit about your educational background. And since the topic of this podcast is Western Civ, maybe you could say something about what kind of education in Western Civ you might have received, however you understand that.
Yeah, so I spent the first 16 years of my life in Ireland, and we had classical studies and things like that, studying the Iliad and Homer and Virgil and lots of other things about classical civilization. Beyond that, when I went beyond that level to high school, it was very much a matter of I was focusing upon maths. That was wanting to get into university to study mathematics and to become a math teacher. In the end, I took a different course, but that was very much my focus. I did English literature alongside that and all the typical stuff, Chaucer and Shakespeare and many others. And in university, I started studying maths and philosophy before being waylaid by theology and switching to studying that. And so in university, I did, after I switched, I did theology at the Evangelical Theological College of Wales, then did a master's in St. Andrews in theology, and then my PhD in Durham. But it seems that when you're studying theology, it's a subject that propels you into all sorts of areas of reflection, and all sorts of areas have been brought into conversation with the Christian deposit of truth. Now, that's something that you'll find reading through literature, reading through philosophy, looking at art. Every single area has been touched by Christian truth. And so if you're thinking about theology, you'll find yourself reflecting upon the culture more broadly, upon Western civilization, but also you'll find that Western civilization is always coming into conversation with the theology at various points too. So Christian theology does not develop in a vacuum. It develops in a cultural context that has been shaped by certain forces. So for instance, it's very hard to understand the development of Christian philosophy without having some sort of knowledge of Plato and Aristotle, without having some understanding of the developments of modern theology out of various philosophical figures, Immanuel Kant, and think about Hegel and others, all these figures that present certain challenges and questions to the faith, that the faith can take on board certain things, respond with others. And so Western civilization has not necessarily been the focus of my studies, but it's always been part of it, because that's just the nature of theology as a discipline, perhaps more than any other discipline, arguably, maybe even more so than history. You can't escape those sorts of questions. They always come to bear upon the subject. because theology is this ongoing conversation that is engaging with these cultural questions and forces.
Great, thank you. That's a great point. And it reminds me of a kind of gotcha that's sometimes thrown at pastors, defenders of Christianity, that, oh, well, don't you know how much debt there is to pagan philosophy, pagan thought? Don't you know that the Romans had a Saturnalia before there was a Christmas, this kind of thing? How do you respond to that? Maybe more about the oh, it's just Platonism or something like this than, the Saturnalia bit.
I would recommend that people just pay attention to the way that the Christian tradition has used those philosophical sources and engaged with them. It has not been uncritical. In fact, it has been extremely critical at many points. There is this conversation taking place with give and take, and there are many ways in which the Christian faith has taken on board ideas from philosophy and worked with them to develop its own understanding of its own theological deposit. And yet that reception has never been uncritical. I mean, well, maybe that's overstating things. There have been times perhaps where it's been less critical than it should have been. But clearly, we can see, for instance, in the development of the Christian understanding of God, the way in which Christological and Trinitarian debates were shaped by philosophical categories. Those categories were reshaped by the Christian faith. They were not taken on board, swallowed whole, and just regurgitated. There was always this sense that these are categories that need to be leavened. They need to be taken on board, reworked, and we're expressing the Christian faith partly within a cultural idiom, partly also these are categories that are apt to express some of the things that we want to express as Christians in a more sophisticated and clear and precise manner. And so the sort of idiom that the Greeks, for instance, offered is an idiom within which the Christian faith can come to its own in ways that it might not within other idioms. And so it's never been simply uncritical adoption. But we live in a society that has a language, that has philosophical frameworks, and we work within those. And it's not inappropriate to take what your culture has given you, to leaven it, and to apply it then to the spreading of the truth of the gospel and the clarification of that truth.
Yeah, that's helpful. We're starting to drive toward the big question that we inevitably come to on this podcast, which is, what is Western civilization? With you, I would like to put the question a little bit differently because of your biblical expertise and your deep spiritual wisdom and experience. I'll put it this way. Winston Churchill once referred to the Western nations, with the exception of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, which were at the time explicitly atheistic, as Christian civilization. Now, is that quite right? Is Western civilization Christian civilization? Has our civilization been deeply formed by Christianity, or has Christianity always been at odds with Western civilization in some way?
That's a good question. And it seems that describing Western civilization now as Christian civilization would seem inappropriate. There are so many ways in which our cultures are in rebellion against or in tension with the Christian faith. You can think about the rise of various forms of euthanasia and the ways that that expresses a sort of hostility to Christian views about human beings and the importance of honoring the image of God that would be unthinkable in past generations, but has become thinkable in many ways because we're moving beyond an explicitly Christian society. Now, that, however, can be true along with the fact that we are in a Christ-haunted society, a civilization in which we can't escape the fact that so many of our concepts, so many of our ways of seeing the world, our instinctive values have been shaped by Christianity. And even if that were denied, there's something about those truths that will constantly come back to haunt us. Even our rejection of those truths will often be a perversion of those truths, or depend upon those truths as their supporting foil. So if those truths fell away, there'd be no positive truth that were an alternative to it. Rather, the alternative to it depends upon the negation of the Christian truth for its support. And that, I think, can be seen in a variety of different cultural debates and issues. When we're thinking about the effect of the Christian faith upon society, we might think of some of the work that's been done recently by people like Tom Holland in Dominion, where he talks about the impact of the Christian faith in Western understanding. More popular level, something like Glenn Scrivener's book, The Air That We Breathe. All of these are descriptions and explorations of the way in which, even as we think that we may have moved beyond the Christian faith, it's everywhere we look. It's within our political values, it's within our social norms, it's built into the very fabric of the constitutions of our nations, into the very fabric of the way that our nations dwell within their lands. We can think about the experience of going through the UK and seeing how much the church and Christian faith has given England its place, were it not for the church buildings that serve as landmarks wherever you go, the parish system, the diocese, the way in which we see pilgrim ways and minsters providing hearts for communities that build up around them. The church is at the foundation of so much of Britain's society, and also politically. Think about the recent coronation and the way in which that exhibits a deep sense of what authority and sovereignty mean in the light of Christian truth, not just an underwriting of power that would have existed in exactly the same way apart from Christian faith, but an understanding that the character of Christian sovereignty needs to leaven our understanding of what it means to have a king or a queen. Now, taking all of those things into account, I think what we see is not so much a Christian society as a society that has been leavened by Christ, a society that can't escape the fact that Christ is built into its very structure at many points. And if you try and extricate Christ from the structure of Western society, you end up with something mangled and distorted. It's one of the challenges, in part, for defining Europe without some understanding of the Christian deposit and how the Christian faith has formed Europe to be what it is. It's like trying to unmake to take some ingredient out of a loaf of bread that has been baked. You can't do that easily without destroying the whole loaf. And in the same way with Christian faith, it's part of what has made us who we are, down to the very instincts that we have and the ways that we see the world. And that, I don't think, gives a claim upon Christian truth that presents us as Christian over against others. The Christian faith is a force working upon Western society, and so often in tension with other forces that have been at work within Western society. It's a long history of wrestling with various aspects of the cultural deposit that we have that are in tension with each other. This is one of the things that Tom Holland has spoken to very well, the fact that we are profoundly formed by Greco-Roman society and philosophy and politics and law and mythology. And yet, when we look back, there's something profoundly foreign about those sorts of societies. There's something profoundly out of keeping with many of the values that we hold most dearly. And the explanation for that can be found in the leavening agent of Christian faith. And so I don't think Western society is straightforwardly Christian society. It's a society that's been leavened by the Christian faith and is constantly in tension with itself because it has disparate sources and it's trying to bring those into line with each other in various ways. And that requires some wrestling with the fact that we have been shaped by Christian faith, but also that we have these other, there's a sort of heterogeneity of the sources of Western society that is part of what makes the conversation around Western society so interesting, because we're constantly working through what aspects of these need to be pushed back against? What aspects should we take on board? What aspects do we need to clarify?
I'm reminded of something that G.K. Chesterton said, that a modern atheist can't be a genuine or simple non-Christian in the way that an old-fashioned pagan perhaps could be. He or she would have to be something like an anti-Christian, or someone turning, keeping most of their values in place, but turning another aspect on its head, or trying to chuck out the metaphysics, or something like that. I have a follow-up question for you that I is a large question, and I didn't at all prepare you for it. So if you want to just reject it and say no thanks, that's a-okay. But you're probably prepared for it in some sense. You'll be familiar with the question when I ask it. When the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, in some respects, that was a very crucial moment in the history. I mean, well, in every respect, it was a very crucial moment in the history of the church. But in some respects, it's been seen as a kind of left turn in the history of the church, perhaps a wrong path, being some kind of compromise between political power and the church, that left the church, or left Christian theology and faith in some kind of with a tainted character, having made this compromise in power that it wouldn't otherwise have made. Now, putting aside the question of whether we today, you and I, would be Christian if Constantine hadn't made the choice that he had, do you think it's right or wrong to look at this as perhaps a tainting compromise between the church and political power? Like I said, I didn't prepare you for this at all, but when you started talking about Tom Holland's book and this broad context, I couldn't resist.
I do think there's a danger of idealizing, where we have this perfect situation where the Christian faith exists in this ideal relationship to culture, and the Constantinian settlement was certainly not that. It was not an ideal situation. It was significantly better than what preceded it in many ways, though. And so it presented new problems and challenges, and the church dealt with those in a mixture of ways, sometimes very badly. And so I don't think we need to idealize the situation after Constantine. What we can do, however, is recognize the opportunities that provided for the church to mature in certain respects that were appropriate to it. So the Christian faith has always made claims that extend beyond the private lives of Christian believers. It's made claims upon civic space, upon political authority, upon law, upon sovereignty. And in those respects, we can see Constantine as one response to those demands, a response that, given the character of the man, the times, and the situation more generally, was imperfect. But nonetheless, it was a partial yet good response that requires, again, continuing leavening. This is not something that we're treating as an ideal, but as something that was a birth of new challenges and a birth of new possibilities. So some of those challenges, for instance, would be the way in which the Christian faith could so easily come to be conceived of in the forms of the form of paganism. So you have the understanding, the sort of liturgical imagination, the cultural imagination of paganism, and you remove paganism, and where paganism once was, you slot in Christian faith. And then what happens is that many of the ways that the Christian faith comes to be conceived are ways that are more consonant with pagan ways of understanding ritual, the church, understanding what it means to have a sacrament, for instance. And the Christian understandings of those are very different. And so it's very easy for certain abuses and distortions to arise within a context where Christian faith is just being, is just replacing a form of paganism. And so I think Constantine is not the sort of ideal that we should be looking back to. We shouldn't be trying to recreate that. It was a particular development at a time within the church's life that was a great improvement upon the sort of persecutions that existed before it. And in many ways, it was a vindication of the martyrs who had died, praying that the Lord would defeat the forces that were arrayed against them. And that defeat in the story of the gospel is so often conversion. And the conversion of the persecutors of the church is a positive thing. What happens when a king converts? Well, one of the things that the king might wonder is, how do I execute Christian justice? How do I execute justice in a way that recognizes the sovereignty of Christ over everything? And it seems to me that Constantine is asking and answering those sorts of questions. And although we don't want to return to his particular answers and that particular form, we need to recognize he was dealing with something very real as a charge of the gospel. And the Christian faith is called to venture into realms of politics, law, sovereignty, society, civic life. And that sort of thing will raise very difficult challenges, particularly for churches that are not mature in various respects. And so we face that challenge in our own time in various ways. Christian faith is involved, for better or worse, in the life of politics and society in both the UK, the US, and in many other countries. And so the question is, how do we do that well? How do we learn the lessons of where things went wrong in the past? How do we allow the force of Christian faith to be that which leavens, rather than allowing the values of society to be imposed upon the Christian faith in a way that sort of enervates or domesticates it? The Christian faith should always be a force that exceeds society, that always leavens society rather than the other way around.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I was just glancing over at my first volume of Richard Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, which I started to think about as you were answering my my curveball, extremely large question, which you did very deftly. As you know, in the 16th and 17th centuries, church government and the government of political society relating to church government were major questions that were being revisited after the Protestant Reformation had put into question the simple apostolic succession of Peter and the kind of church government that had persisted through the Middle Ages. And there were a variety of paths that people took in that process. And one of them was simply thinking, or I don't want to say simply, but turning back to what was the construction of the early church, and as much as they could glean it from the New Testament, sometimes even the Old Testament, sometimes even Levitical priests and things like this, and thinking that it was incredibly straightforward to take those forms and bring them into the modern context. I say thinking that it was incredibly straightforward because, as I'm sure you know, it is not at all straightforward to see how these things even existed in their original context. That isn't totally easy. And then seeing how they should come forward. Now, I think Hooker is an example of someone who didn't do that exactly, who did a kind of mixture of looking at this is why in some respects he's a conservative political thinker as well as a theologian. He was looking at the forms that existed in England, that had existed in England for a long time, and looking as well at the construction, how he could reconstruct the early church, and trying to put these things into some conversation. I bring all that up because I know there is contemporary thought about, does the church need to revisit its role among Protestants as well? Does the church need to revisit its role in connection with the state? What do you think is the beginning of the right, a first step to take in thinking about what is a good organization for the church today in its relation to political society? What's a good first step, without asking you to lay out a political theory?
Yep. I think, as you mentioned, Richard Hooker, his approach is very helpful. It's been described by Rowan Williams as a sort of contemplative pragmatism. So on the one hand, you're thinking very deeply about the truths of the Christian faith. You're thinking deeply about the truths of philosophy and other realities. And yet you're also taking great care to think about the political questions, the questions of what is possible. You're trying to think about what are the structures that we have inherited, what is the shape of the society that we're working with, what are the facts on the ground. And what he's trying to do is to bring those deep truths of reflection into concrete application in a very specific context, recognizing that we are creations of, and yet also those who can creatively respond to our history. We've arisen as beings within our particular moment in society and in the history of our societies. We've arisen out of that history, and we have a certain legacy that we have inherited as part of that history. And we have an understanding of the situation in which we find ourselves that's given by reflection upon that. And yet we're not determined by that completely. We're those who can reflect upon deeper truths that are perennial, truths that are shared by people across human societies. And we're able to then reflect upon how to go forward in a way that's faithful to what has come before, that honors the deposit that we have received, and also is concerned to bring our societies more into line with the deeper truths of human nature, the deeper truths of God's revelation, the deeper truths of wisdom in the ordering of politics, etc. Now, when it comes to questions of politics, that, I think, gives a certain tenor of conversation and manner of reflection about these things. So I think many people, you mentioned a sort of primitivism, the attempt to return to some earlier stage. Now, that can take many forms. In the case of the Christian church, it's the early church and the attempt to return to Acts 2, for instance, the early Christian communities that are described at the end of that chapter. In the experience of nations, it can be the attempt to return, for instance, to the thinking of the founders. Now, the founders have a lot to teach us about the understanding of the American polity, just as the early church has a lot to teach us about how to understand the church. We're not dismissing the importance of the primitive church or the primitive republic. Yet we're also recognizing the limits of those sorts of approaches. Others would take a sort of approach that's so emphasizing the authority of the Bible, or the authority, let's say, in the other sphere of something like the constitutional documents that define a polity, going back to those and saying that's where you find the key. In both cases, there can be a detachment from the concrete facts on the ground to consider how wisely to appropriate those, to relate those to the current situation. And so I think in many ways the key here is an understanding of history, an understanding of the ways in which we're thinkers in time, and we think in a particular location in time and space, and from that context. And that requires that we take careful stock of where we are standing. So if you're thinking about politics, it really matters to understand the political society you're living in, so that you're able to, as it were, move with the grain of that society. To recognize, for instance, there are some very helpful thoughts in the early Reformed tradition that may not apply to American society or modern British society in the same way as they did to a canton of Switzerland many centuries ago, or the situation of a small principate. You're in principality, you're dealing with a very different sort of situation there. Same way when you have a very settled population of about 1 million people. That's very different from the US with something like, I don't know, 3 1/3 or 333 million people or something like that. It's a very different sort of situation. You need to understand the actual shape of your society. And then, having understood that, to take the examples of the past, to take the teaching of foundational documents, whether that's the scripture or some constitutional document, and then bring those into careful, prudent, and wise dialogue, and being able to perceive those things that are most salient and important about society as history has created it. So one of the challenges that we face within modern society is that we are in large part working with constitutional arrangements that precede radical revolutions in the way that we communicate, in the way that we move around, in the way that we understand ourselves. And those have arisen from forces that are not primarily political, but technological, or to do with our media. And so the challenge is to be able to take those older documents and to think carefully about the new realities that we face, within which there will be quite naturally a very different conception of what it means to be a nation, people, what it means to belong to a particular place. And these are challenges that require not just a sort of mathematical working out of some foundational principles. It requires creativity and imagination, the ability to tell a story that is compelling, that is able to include many different vantage points, or the recognition that there can be multiple stories that form a polity. Now, those sorts of challenges are challenges for which a knowledge of the foundational documents, a knowledge of the foundational constitutional principles, a foundation of the early polity will be very helpful, but it won't take us far enough. And so I think there have been many attempts to speak to modern polities in the light of scripture or as a sort of retrieval project that have missed the importance of this more prudential approach to reality. And that's something that I think Hooker can give us some of those basic sensibilities of how we relate in a non-revolutionary way to the actual polities that we find ourselves in, to recognize that we inherit certain things that are not perfect. And it's a bad idea to try and rush to create some sort of perfection from pure principles that are just not attentive to the reality that we have in front of us and to those things that are good for the flourishing of that.
Thank you. That's just a wonderful answer, Alastair. I'm so grateful that you expounded some of the thought in Hooker in that way. And what you said resonates a lot with some of the things that I cherish very closely. I believe very much in the capacity of mature reflection upon the past to derive prudential examples for today. I consider myself in this podcast to be pretty open to different points of view, but the one that I admit that I'm extremely prejudiced against is the idea that the past and the present are simply incommensurable. That's something that gets laid out in various forms, and I've been reminded of that by people. Don't you know that the classical world simply has nothing to do with us today, or even more, the 17th century simply has nothing to do with us today. They had a completely irretrievable historical imaginary and all this kind of thing. And as is so often the case, there's a grain of truth to that, but there is a kind of anchor, dead weight that just pulls down the possibility of learning how to live from the past. Because after all, the most important question that we always have to keep in mind is what we should do, right? What should we do? That kind of incommensurable idea is it's simply intolerable to me.
And the challenge there is recognizing on the one hand that we are not the same as the past. There is a gulf, there is a difference, and we can't retrieve it. We've been remade through events that have been subsequent to it. But it is also constitutive of us. There's no way to escape the ways that it has been part of forming us to be the sorts of people with the sorts of values, with the sort of world that we inhabit. And then also recognizing that when we're engaging with these things in the past, it's not just that we're engaging with something that has been part of forming us. We're also engaging with part of a continuing conversation that has been forming us all the way along. It's not just it formed us back then.
Yeah.
We're engaging with sources that we've been reflecting upon ever since, and our society has been positioning itself relative to in an ongoing conversation. And then recognizing that so much of what we're dealing with is a reflection upon deep truths of human nature
Yes.
and the world in which we live, which are perennial. And so in one sense, they are historical, and they're significant historically because they are part of our history that has shaped and formed us, not least through the reflection that has occurred upon those sources subsequently. But also, these are sources that are worthy in as much as they are encouraging us to reflect upon things that we share with people across all times and spaces and cultures. And as we engage with the deposit culturally that we have received, we'll find that it has the potential to speak quite some way beyond its original context. There's something not just perennial, but timely about many of the works that we read from Greco-Roman sources, or when we read the scripture, we feel that it is speaking directly into our lives today, partly because we've been formed by it, but partly because it's a perennially true word that is able to speak with a timely power. And even in the scriptural formation, it seems that there was a recognition of this. As we read through the prophets, often we find that they don't have clear temporal grounding. There are many points in the prophets where you're wondering, what's this referring to? I don't have any sense of the historical events that this is relating to. And yet at the same time, you're reading through something like the Book of the 12, the Minor Prophets, and you're seeing again and again this reference to the day of the Lord, which becomes a broader concept emerging out of many different days of the Lord, days of judgment, and comes into this wider, more archetypal understanding of what it means for God to come near in judgment and in salvation. And then that gets applied in the New Testament. This is something that we find, I think, when we're reflecting upon past sources of culture and history and philosophy and civilization, art, etc. It can speak to us in part because of the themes that emerge being those that have relation to archetypal realities that are present within every single culture, and have an ability to be a deposit that we can give and benefit other people with, people who are not even from our culture.
That's a wonderful point. And when someone first begins the branch of biblical study that's called higher criticism or historical criticism, it can seem as if it can cut out the possibility of spiritual reflection upon scripture, because after all, if this particular passage from the prophet Isaiah is in fact referring, one might say, just referring, put that in quotation marks, to a particular historical event, and it's referring to it obliquely, but that's what it's referring to. And once you have identified the historical event, you now know, okay, that's what the passage means, and we move on. However, as you're pointing out, that reading the Bible itself shows that not only in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well, people were reflecting on these passages they were themselves reflecting on these passages from the prophets as if they had perennial importance, not merely as if they pointed just to a single event. And if the prophets themselves had an understanding that they were speaking two-mouthed in some sense, where at the one hand they were talking about a specific historical event, but on the other hand they were talking the eternal truth of God, the way God works in his dealings with man, then what are we talking about? It seems like everybody has an understanding of what's going on here. It's only a kind of naive, just in the sense of unstudied expectation that the Bible should be nothing but kind of disembodied, just purely disembodied wisdom that has no that comes out of no situation whatsoever. That's the only thing that really seems to be punctured by that.
And here it can be helpful maybe to think about the concept of canon. The canon of scripture is one of the things that shows that these texts are not merely referring to a very limited context. They speak across time to the church and the people of God in all different times and contexts. So when you're reading Isaiah, you recognize the ways that it's relating to the Assyrian crisis or to the Babylonian captivity, but you're also able to hear within it signs of something greater and signs of something that we can take and apply to our lives here and now. It tells us something about God, for instance. Now, when we're reading the Western canon is functioning differently within that terminology than it is in the case of scripture. But nonetheless, there's also something about that when we're dealing with the great works of Greco-Roman poetry, of drama, of literature, of history, we're learning things that can speak beyond their original times. They may be addressing very specific political crises of their day. And yet, as they reflect upon those issues, it has the ability to speak beyond. That's one of the things I've always found fascinating in someone like Richard Hooker, where it's really obvious. He's dealing with some very contemporary, specific issues very much in dialogue with certain Puritans, Cartwright and others. And yet, as you're reading his work, he gets down to really deep principial issues. And those principial issues are some of the most timely and relevant ones in our own day. Now, one of the reasons that the canon has become the canon, in the broader sense of the cultural canon, is because people have been having conversations about texts for millennia, recognizing the ability of certain texts to speak beyond their original context. And in having that conversation, have become trajects for that conversation to continue, and to the sparks of those conversations to cross great gulfs between different cultures and contexts, and to speak into new worlds and to speak forth new worlds, as those worlds have been informed and created out of a vision that's been forged first within older conversations and texts. Now, as we're encouraging people to get into the text of scripture or get into the canon of Western civilization or some other civilization, we're trying to encourage them to become part of an ongoing conversation that has a continued generative power and ability to speak beyond its initial historical confines, and to prove that those aren't really confines at all. It's able to speak to different horizons.
One of the things that I like to point out is that there's really nothing very narrow about getting an education in Western civilization, in the sense that just getting a bit of an education in the thought or classic works of ancient Greece requires an immediate large expansion of horizons beyond what you already know and are already familiar with. So I sort of take for granted from your answer that you don't necessarily think that the teaching of Western civilization is, merely the teaching of immediately accessible, transcendent values that we're just going to get, and there you go. Now you've read the Republic, so you know what justice is. It's not entirely clear that even Plato knows what justice is after having written the Republic. He revisits that question in different ways. But I like your description of it being part of an ongoing conversation, and I think that's something we've wanted to emphasize on some of these podcast conversations, that this is a part of an ongoing conversation. This is not the end of conversation, but really it's the beginning. So why is it you think that people challenge the teaching of Western civilization courses? And do you think it's merely having a kind of naive version of Western civilization in mind, or even a kind of triumphalist version of Western civilization, which I do try to discourage people from thinking about as the default, because even though there is a normative quality to that word civilization, I like to point out that it's a little bit different from just saying culture, right? Civilization, as you know, implies a certain that this is an achievement, right? Nevertheless, I think that these different reasons that people give, not all of them are equally valid. So, what is your opinion on why people challenge Western Civ, and what about it is compelling or not to you?
I think just to one of the remarks that you made earlier on in that question, it really is valuable to know the Republic and things like that, not just to know the answer that, okay, we now know what justice is. I didn't actually need to read the Republic. I just needed to read a Wikipedia article on justice, or maybe the Cliff Notes. There is something about a society where people are expected, in academia at least, and more generally in the society, to be conversant with certain basic fundamental texts. And when there is a common repository of knowledge about these texts, mostly with scripture, but then broader than that, with things like Plato, Aristotle, with various literature of your own nation, so like Chaucer, or certain poetry from various sources with Shakespeare. And so when someone alludes to that,
or Milton, maybe just
or even
thought.
Milton,
even Milton, yes.
We'll make some exceptions for Puritans, but in these cases, it gives it's like language, but on a higher level. When you have a common language, you're able to speak to people who share that language, and a canon is a sort of repository of shared sources and things that you can allude to, and it gives you a sophistication in being able to speak about situations and bring things to bear upon those situations from a wide range of sources. Now, it's one thing to have read all these things yourself. It's a very different thing to be around people who have also read those things, and who you know have read those things, and they know that you have read those things, and that you know that they have read those things. There is, in that context, something more than just, oh, I've been formed by these ideas. There's something of a shared realm of communication where you can talk about those ideas together. You can allude to those pieces of poetry, and you can be sure that people will get those allusions. Now, we have within Western society today a collapse of the canon. And so what you have is constant references to things like Harry Potter, because that's something that everyone can be presumed upon to have read. At least a majority of people are familiar enough with Harry Potter for a reference to be made to it. Or to historical events, you can make a reference to the Second World War, because that's the one piece of history that people know. Now, if we had a broader reservoir of knowledge, if we had a deep knowledge of scripture, for instance, you could refer to all sorts of different situations and be sure that people would be able to pick up your meaning and your allusions. And you'll
I'm
be
sorry to interrupt, but even 150 years ago, people did, right?
Yeah.
People reference things that you might hear about the woman in the well in a Civil War letter or something like that. That's a random example, but
yes, there's just an expectation that people know these things. And so part of our commitment to studying the canon of a particular civilization is to be part of a conversation, to be literate, to be those who are able to be participants and good hearers, to pick up upon what's being said, and to participate in an ongoing conversation, taking things forward ourselves. Now, that does not require taking one particular stance. One of the things that is characteristic of a conversation is there can be many different ways to participate within it, many different vantage points and many different positions that are taken within it. Now, when we're talking about justice, for instance, you can look through the Western canon and see many different angles of approach, many different theories, and the ability to take those theories and think about them and reflect upon them in dialogue with each other is one of the things a canon allows for. Now, I think many people, when they think about Western civilization, they see it as a more parochial and chauvinistic attempt to drive forward the concerns of a specific cultural group, maybe even to express the supremacy of that group over other cultural and civilizational contexts. So we won't read certain works of Indian or Chinese history and philosophy and art because Western civilization is where it's at. That's not the approach that we should be taking. Western civilization happens in most cases to be ours. It's the one that we've been born into. It's the one that we've become most conversant with. It's the one that surrounds us in many respects. It doesn't mean it's the best, but it does mean that it is ours. And as a result, we need to take a certain responsibility for it, to bring sometimes new sources into conversation. It's one of the features, I think, of Western or European culture that Remy Brague talks about when he talks about the importance of the Middle Ages and the way in which the European approach to different cultures outside of itself, Greco-Roman society, the Hebrew scriptures, and then the Greek scriptures of the New Testament, was to digest those, to constantly be drawing upon sources outside of itself and to learn from those sources, not to see itself as self-sufficient, but as constantly needing to have a conversation within itself, but a conversation that was always drawing upon things outside of itself too. Now, that is something that easily gets forgotten when people have a more I suppose, chauvinistic understanding of what it means to study Western civilization. Western civilization itself is constantly drawing upon these external sources without forgetting that it is itself, that it's engaging with those sources from a particular vantage point, from a particular history, with another set of texts and sources and cultural background that's informing that investigation. And I think that answers one of the greater concerns that people have about Western civilization within our current context, which is that it's exclusive, it's something that is maybe xenophobic, it's something that is setting students up to reject other civilizational sources, to be proud and self-sufficient in their own civilization, and failing to recognize that that's just not the way that Western civilization itself has developed. Western civilization has always been drawing along the way upon other sources, but has also been very clear about what itself is. It's had an understanding of itself, standing over against these things and drawing from them, but not just becoming nothing in this constant exchange. I think on the other hand, there are those who have this particularly within Christian circles, this wariness and suspicion of sources that are not drawn from the pure well of Scripture. And so you want to get back to this primitive biblical understanding and draw upon those sources in their undiluted purity, and then we can form our understanding. And we should be wary of Western civilization, of classical sources, because they're clearly drawn from pagan cultures. And again, this is something that as Christians we need to resist. I think that the Christian faith has welcomed and leavened culture. And one of the benefits of Western civilization is seeing the way that this ongoing conversation has pulled upon these sources and transformed them in the process, while also being shaped in its articulation, in its expression, and in its concrete manifestation of the Christian faith through cultural impulses and in various other sources. Now, I think that gives us the ability to speak to the question of Western society and civilization with a sort of confidence of identity, that we know that this is it has formed us. We've been shaped by these ideas, by these sources, by these works of art, and yet we're able to have an openness to other sources beyond them, to digest new sources, to think about what might we learn from Chinese civilization, while also remaining Western as opposed to Chinese. We have our own understanding. And I think that also allows for people to come into a study of these sources without necessarily having a Western cultural background, partly because it's a way of exploring the perennial character of truth, that there is something that is appropriate about talking about the humanities, because we're studying something that is appropriate to human nature, not just a particular culture that can grow old and irrelevant as time goes on. We're studying something that, when we're reading Plato or Aristotle, when we're reading other early Christian sources, we're reading things about human nature that can speak to us with an urgency today. Mm. And so people who come from non-Western societies can still gain from these sorts of sources. And likewise, there are many ways in which we can develop and enrich and progress this tradition of conversation. We don't have to be stagnant and constantly returning to sources that never get developed or added to. And that process of challenging is one also that allows for multiple different voices to take many different postures towards the texts. We're not determined to just welcome them and agree with them in every respect. We're able to critically and thoughtfully appropriate and stand relative to them, to take certain aspects of them or work with those, to work against other aspects. And I think this allows for an open conversation with the tradition that has been characteristic of it throughout its history, and that enables us to adapt and adopt new things into it without being stymied by the challenge of a society that needs to go forward and introduce many different conversations with new sources, with new cultural deposits that have become part of our cultural conversation. The classical and the Western cultural project has always been open to those sorts of conversations, and we should explore that aspect of it too.
Well, thank you very much, Alastair. I'm really grateful for you coming on the podcast. It was great talking.
Thank you for having me on.
Right.